This notion fulfilled itself on one side in the self-assured spirit that acted, and on the other in religion. In religion, it won for consciousness the absolute content as content, or in the form of picture thinking, the form of otherness for consciousness. On the other hand, in the prior shape, the form is that of the self itself, for it contains the self-assured spirit that acts. The self accomplishes the life of absolute spirit. This shape is, as we have seen, that simple notion, which, however, surrenders its eternal essence. It is there in the real world, or it acts. The self-sundering, or stepping forth into existence, stems from the purity of the notion, for this is absolute abstraction or negativity. Similarly, the notion gets the element of its actuality, or the being it contains, in pure knowledge itself. For this is simple immediacy, which is as much being and existence as it is essence. The former, negative thought; the latter, positive thought itself. Finally, this existence, both as existence and as duty, is just as much the reflectedness into self out of pure knowledge, or the state of evil. This withdrawal into itself constitutes the antithesis of the notion, and is thus the emergence of the pure knowledge of the essence, the knowing that does not act and is not actual. But this emergence in the antithesis is participation in it. The pure knowledge of essence has, in principle, renounced its simple unity, for it is the self-sundering, or the negativity which the notion is. So far as this self-sundering is the process of becoming for itself, it is evil. So far as it is the in itself, it remains good. Now, what at first happens in principle is at the same time explicitly for consciousness, and is thus double. It is both for consciousness, and also is its being for self, or its very own act. The same thing that is already posited in principle now, therefore, repeats itself as consciousness's knowledge of it and conscious act. Each in relation to the other lets go of the independent determinateness with which it comes forth against it. This letting go is the same renunciation of the one-sidedness of the notion that in itself constituted the beginning, but it is now its own act of renunciation, just as the notion which it renounces is its own notion. That in itself, that is the immediacy of the beginning, is in truth, it as negativity, no less mediated. What it is in truth, it now also makes explicit, and the negative is as determinateness of each, both for the other and in itself self-suspending. One of the two parts of the antithesis is the disparity between the notion's being within itself in its individuality and universality, the other, the disparity between its abstract universality and the self. The former dies to its being for self, disowns itself, makes confession. The latter renounces the obstinacy of its abstract universality, and in so doing dies to its lifeless self and to its unmoved universality. The former has thus completed itself through the moment of universality, which is essence, and the latter through the universality, which is self. Through this movement of action, spirit has come on the scene as a pure universality of knowing, which is self-consciousness. As self-consciousness, that is the simple unity of knowing. It is only through action that spirit is in such a way that it is really there. That is, when it raises its existence into thought, and thereby into an absolute antithesis, and returns out of this antithesis in and through the antithesis itself. Paragraph 796 is quite long, and I think our commentary will have to similarly extend pretty far. I do want to call attention to two main things before we get started with the commentary proper. One is that if you actually look at the German text, or you look at some of the other translations, it appears that Miller somehow ended up transposing two sentences. So where the paragraph ends in the Miller translation is not really where it ends in Hegel's original or in more recent translations. It's not a big deal because I think it doesn't really change the tenor of what's going on unless you are very hermeneutically oriented and think that every single placement matters so much. I think that it's okay, but I did want to signal that just in case anyone is looking at the German text or looking at other translations. The other thing that I want to say is that if you're reading this for the first or second time, you might be missing out on something that I think is actually quite important in this paragraph, and I'm going to hit on this a number of times. Namely, that action, handeln, is incredibly important. Actuality, as it's translated here, or reality, Wirklichkeit, is also incredibly important. And that is where Hegel is going with things. Absolute knowing makes it sound as if what we're doing is very abstract and purely on the speculative or cognitive side, not on the practical side. And I think one of the great powers of Hegel's phenomenology and his philosophy in general is not just, let's look at history, or we've got dialectical development, or things like that. It is that Hegel is constantly trying to show us, to bring us back to the importance of real life, actuality. We are spirit. The consciousness and self-consciousness developing in this is also spirit, and it develops by doing things, by taking positions. I think that all too often gets left out in the summaries or presentation, or even sometimes, weirdly enough, application of Hegel's work. So let's take a look at this. There's a lot going on. You notice that we've got kind of like a rotation or circuit through a whole bunch of different important transitions. He begins by talking about this notion fulfilling itself, or literally gave itself, gab, right? Itself fulfillment, Erfüllung. How so? On two sides. And we're going to see a lot of binaries here being brought together. In the self-assured spirit that acted, right? There's that key theme right there. And then in religion. And, religion was this big section that we just got through. It's supposed to lead us into absolute knowing. So how does religion work? He said, in religion, what was the attainment, the achievement of it? It won for consciousness the absolute content, the Inhalt, as content. Or, if we want to oppose something to content, a form of what? Picture thinking, Vorstellung, representation, right? And this happens, as we saw, through the community. We don't have to go through all of this again. But it's really interesting here that he calls picture thinking the form of otherness for consciousness. Why would picture thinking be the form of otherness for consciousness? After all, isn't picture thinking, if it's thinking, now, of course, Hegel is not calling picture thinking thinking. That is Miller's translation. But representing, the same thing would hold, isn't it a consciousness that is doing the representing? Yes. But the consciousness that is religious comes to approach that, the narrative, or if we want to think about the absolute religion, Christianity, the crucifix, right, with the body representing something. All of this, it's approaching it as an other that it can relate itself to. And there's a danger of, as we've seen, falling back into the old form of, we saw this in the self-consciousness section, the unhappy consciousness, where there's this estrangement, this disconnect, right? So now he's going to leave religion behind in this discussion and say, okay, what's going on this other side? Self-assured spirit that acted. The prior shape of the form that is that of the self itself. Prior to what? Prior to the religion section, right? That's how we wound up finishing spirit and getting into religion in the first place. So he says it contains the self-assured spirit that acts or acted, right? Handeln. The self accomplishes the life of absolute spirit. So this is really quite interesting. And I don't want you to pass through this too quickly. Think about what the implications of this are. This means that, again, the phenomenology, as I've pointed out so many times, is not a purely linear process. It's that we go back and forth and back and forth, and we realize that, there's stuff back there that we need to bring forward. That's what Aufheben is, right? And so the self-assured spirit that acted is where some really important stuff was taking place for the development of consciousness. It accomplishes the life of absolute spirit. And then he says, this shape, this gestalt, is, as we have seen, that simple notion, which, however, surrenders its eternal essence, right? Now, what is this surrendering its eternal essence? It's no longer remaining in a sort of abstraction or just pure representation. It's finding stuff out about itself, the world, others, its community, right? How does it do that? It is there. And Miller has bracketed here, in the real world. I don't think Miller's wrong about that, right? It is there. To be there is to be in some particular location. And how is it there? It acts, as Hegel says. It does something, right? And the actions could be as trivial as somebody saying prayers or wondering about their existence and feeling certain things. Action doesn't always have to be some big coordinated plan, but it is getting to know reality through acting, right? So this is going to lead us now to thinking about the simple notion, and he tells us that it's splitting, right? It's self-sundering and zweien, quite literally a twoing of itself at a distance. It is coming apart, you could say. He also talks about stepping forward or stepping into existence, hervortreten, right? Stepping out there into the world. Now, this is very, very interesting, isn't it? You almost have Hegel sounding a little bit like Heidegger here in his discussion of Dasein, don't you? Or we could talk about many others as well. This is all there in Hegel's phenomenology because this is part of the way that Hegel conceptualizes or thinks through what it is for spirit in human beings to actually make sense of the notion or the concept, the Begriff, right? So he says this stems from the purity of the notion, the Reinheit, right? For this is absolute abstraction or negativity. It has a pretty high language there. It's negativity, right? This is something that we're quite familiar with from the preface onward. How does consciousness, self-consciousness, spirit, how does it work by not accepting the world just as it is or every single explanation as having been given and introducing something, if not necessarily new or original, something that is in addition, a surplus. But the surplus always comes out of what is not there, negativity. Again, sounding kind of like Heidegger, right? But what we should really say is that Heidegger sounds a lot like Hegel, since one is coming much later, right? So he goes on and he says, similarly, the notion, right, the simple notion here, the concept, the Begriff, gets the element of its actuality Wirklichkeit, right? I just mentioned that. Or the being it contains in pure knowledge itself, for this is simple immediacy. And in immediacy, Unmittelbarkeit, right? And this is going to come up at several different points. There's no true pure immediacy in anything that Hegel is going to tell us about, because there's no pure immediacy in our experience, in the reality we inhabit. We can always take what appears to be immediate. I mean, think about sense certainty, right? The most immediate, what suggests itself to us right off the bat. We unpack it, and there's all sorts of other things there. So interestingly, he's got this phrase, in this pure immediacy, it's as much being, sein, as existence, Dasein, as essence, Wesen. These are all just kind of being thrown around together and not strictly distinguished from itself. And then he goes on, the former negative thought, the latter positive thought itself, so positivity, negativity being brought together here. Now, we move on through what? Attending to existence. And again, fascinating, isn't it? To see, what is our existence really like? Are we just these beings that go around, engaging with the world in certain ways, like we nourish ourselves, we eat a little something over here, and then we run around, we look at stuff. Our existence is already one caught up with moral values. Like it or not, by virtue of being human, normativity, in a very broad sense, is part of the nature, the essence, if we want to say, the concept of human being. And we discover this through our encountering our duties, our requirements, the norms that impose themselves upon us, and trying to act, at least in some respect, if not in accordance with them, at least in relation to them. And we do this constantly, right? So he says this is just as much the reflectedness into self out of pure knowledge, or the state of evil. And we saw this before, right? This has come up several times in the religion section, also in the spirit section, when we looked at how it is that human action works. This comes up a number of times. Evil, böse. The evil and the good are supposed to be opposites, right? They're supposed to be in a contradiction, or as Miller's going to translate it here, antithesis, a Gegensatz. But it turns out that they're, for Hegel, intimately interconnected in human consciousness and in our moral action that we engage in, which is encompassed into religion through, representation. So he goes on and he says, it's the emergence of the pure knowledge of the essence, right? The Wesen, the knowing that does not act and is not actual. Now, can the knowing remain like that? No. We are the knowers, and we act in actuality, in Wirklichkeit. So he says this emergence in the antithesis, right? We're going to have this withdrawal into itself constituting the antithesis of the notion, the Gegensatz, and is the emergence of this. The emergence in the antithesis is participation, Teilnahme, Teilnehmen, rather, in it. And interestingly, we're going to see this term Teil come up in the distinctions a little bit later on, right? So, antithesis, contradiction, better, and the being governed by the contradiction means engaging in the contradiction itself. So it's not as if the contradiction puts things into this box over here, the evil box, and this box over here, the good box. Good and evil here are intimately intertwined, and they're connected up with metaphysical notions for Hegel as well, as they have been throughout the phenomenology. So he goes on and he says, the pure knowledge of essence has in principle, right? And in principle is an sich, right? So we've got an sich and für sich being used here, not just for the good, which is the an sich, the in itself, and the evil, the for itself. Those things, those categories are also coming up in their relation to each other. You can look at the opposition between the an sich, the in itself, and the für sich, the for itself, in an an sich way and in a für sich way, which transforms into no longer just being für sich, but being für all sorts of other things as well, as we're going to see. So he tells us here, it is the self-sundering, right? It's renounce the simple unity. It is the self-sundering, once again we see that, or the negativity, which the notion is, so far as this self-sundering is the process of becoming for itself, it is evil, right? So far as it is the in itself, it remains good. And then he says, what happens in principle is at the same time explicitly for consciousness and thus double. It can't remain purely in itself or in principle. It can't remain unmediated. It has to be mediated by the for itself. You can't have, if we want to play with words here, you can't have a plain old good, simple rendering of the opposition between good and evil. The opposition itself, the contradiction itself, has to become transformed. And that is what we see happening as we go on in this. How so? What's the double? It is both for consciousness, right? For Bewusstsein, and is its being for self, or, once again, key thing, its own act, tun, an action, a thing that it does, which comes under Handeln, action, and Wirklichkeit, actuality. So, what does this lead us to? Another transition. Each of them lets go. What's each of them? Good, evil, or the in principle and the for consciousness, or the for consciousness and the being for self in its own act. Each of them lets go, and this is going to lead us to the next understanding of the antithesis. Let's go of what? Independent, selbstständige, determinateness, right? So the determinateness, now where did we get determinateness in here at all? We're in actuality. That's where we're going to get determinateness, right? We're not going to get it in these purely abstract understandings of the notion. So he goes on and he says, it lets go of the independent determinateness with which it comes forth against it. And he says this letting go is the same renunciation of the one-sidedness of the notion that in itself constituted the beginning, right? One-sidedness. This is always a problem. We're not going to have absolute knowing that is merely one-sided, or if we want to pick up on this, we're not going to be able to have a dynamic way of using our mental faculties that reduces down to representation and us being opposed to it in absolute knowing. So, going on, he says it's now its own act of renunciation, and here he's got something really interesting to say. So the notion which it renounces is its own notion. We cannot remain content with just sticking with the text. We have to think this out dynamically within, Hegel's not saying this here, but I would venture to say this, and this might be one way in which we can keep Hegel relevant. Within the scope of our own lives, we have to think this out. What is it for me to have, by the time I get to the end of this book, absolute knowing as the person I am, not Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, not some guy writing this in the early 1800s, but somebody living in the 21st century in the culture that I inhabit. How do I make this something relevant, something possible for myself? That's the notion that he's talking about here, renouncing its own notion. So he goes on and he says that in itself, of the beginning is in truth, in Wahrheit, as negativity, no less mediated. We are fully mediated, right? This whole process is being mediated by Hegel's text. We're mediating it by thinking it through in our present circumstance. So he goes on and he says, what it is in truth, it now also makes explicit. It brings it out. And the negative is as determinateness of each both for the other and in itself self-suspending. What is that going to look like? Here he's going to bring up antithesis again, which, again, same word, Gegensatz, the contradiction. What is the contradiction here? What does it turn into? Well, it's got two parts, two sides to it. The antithesis of the notion, the living concept as we're working it out. Of the two parts, one is the disparity, Ungleichheit. Both of these have a inequality, a not mapping up, a not being commensurate with each other. An Ungleichheit on one side and Ungleichheit on the other side. So the disparity, or Ungleichheit, between what? The notions being within itself in its individuality. This is actually one long string of German terms, right? Being within itself in its individuality of this notion, its Einzelnheit, right? Versus universality, Allgemeinheit. That's kind of cool here because if you think about what Hegel's doing with language, universality, something nice and simple right here, right? And being within itself in its individuality, oh, that's complicated, isn't it? And these are being opposed to each other as one side of this contradiction. What's the other side of the contradiction, right? The disparity, the Ungleichheit, between its abstract universality. So universality here is not necessarily abstract, but now it's abstract universality versus the self, what it actually is. And he goes on and he says, the former dies to its being for self, disowns itself, makes confession. The latter renounces the obstinacy of its abstract universality. So the self is going to become important, and doing so dies to its lifeless self and to its unmoved universality, right? So none of these are complete except in relation to each other within this antithesis or contradiction. And then he tells us, through this movement of action, and this is actually going to be the end part, spirit has come on the scene as a pure universality of knowing. Now, it sounds here like Hegel saying, all right, we did all the transformational stuff we needed to do. Now we get our pure knowing. No, the knowing is itself an active knowing, and a knowing of a being within the world that is doing things. So he goes on, it is self-consciousness, right? And as self-consciousness, that is the simple unity of knowing. And here we get something really interesting. There's a transformation of language happening here that Miller's translation, unfortunately, covers up a little bit. It is only through action that spirit is in such a way that it is really there, actually there. That is when it raises its existence into thought and thereby into an absolute antithesis. Now, absolute antithesis here is absolute Entgegensetzung. Not the same thing as Gegensatz, right? Although you notice there's a lot of similarity there. But this is, the Ent has a sort of spatial quality to it. It is pulling these things apart, as we saw before, right? Entzweien. Right? So is this, absolutely a distinction between contradiction and opposition, as is often translated? No. But it is important. And it returns out of this antithesis in and through the antithesis itself. Now, Hegel's not using the term 3 times. he's just using sort of referential language here, but that's what it is engaged in. So what can we say to sum this up? With all of these interesting transformations going on, we come back again to the importance of action and being in a world, being within actuality or reality. We can talk as much as we want about pure or absolute knowing, but that is going to be absolute knowing that understands itself within a context, cultural context, a context of other people's lives, of one's own life. That's, I think, what we need to be reading in here in order to continue this advance through this thing that Hegel is calling absolute knowing.